Russian propaganda can be highly effective and yet corrosive as well. It does not necessarily try to convince you of its point of view, rather to create division, conflict, and in many cases, apathy and inaction. Today, we're going to be looking at the effects of propaganda and in particular, looking at the structure and editorial technology that underpinned Russia today. Even though that's no longer available in the UK, it's interesting to understand how that came about and what the intent behind the Russia Today concept was. The Silicon Curtain podcast has been created to explore issues around propaganda, narratives, and techniques, and the threat they pose to open societies. If you like the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Stephen Hutchings is Professor of Russian Studies at the University of Manchester. Stephen was formerly Professor of Cultural Studies and Russian at the University of Surrey and Associate Professor of Russian at the University of Rochester, New York. He is President of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies and was a member of the RAE 2008 subpanel for Russian and Slavonic languages and cultures. He is on the editorial boards of several journals, including the Russian Journal of Communication, ArtMargins, and Russian Studies in Literature. Stephen, hopefully all that intro was correct.
One minor correction. Unlike Putin, I'm unable to kind of re-elect myself as president of BASI, so we're only allowed to serve one term. And my term ended some while ago, so that we've had several subsequent presidents since me. And again, unlike Putin, I have no intention of returning to that position.
That's the essence of democracy, isn't it? Being able to kick somebody out.
The Constitution wouldn't allow me to do so, even if I wanted.
Well, let's start with RT, because even though that's not available anymore in the UK, I believe it's blocked. It certainly was active for a number of years, and many leading British politicians and many contrarians, if you want to give them a label like that, did actually appear on the channel, didn't they?
Yeah, I notice you're using the past tense, and I absolutely see why that is. Strictly speaking, if you really want to follow RT, you can still do so, albeit not in its broadcast mode. If I get my smartphone out and I go to the RT app, which I have installed, I can access RT content readily in all languages, or all languages in which it operates, including English, French, Russian, German, Spanish. So, you know,
it's still there, alive and kicking. Yeah.
If you're familiar with VPN technology, there are ways around the restrictions. Interestingly, RT has sort of mirrored the exactly the same advice and instructions that the BBC and other broadcasters gave when the Russian restrictions hit. So those who really want to access RT can still do so, even in the UK. And of course, whilst it is certainly no longer available as a television channel in the UK or anywhere in Europe or the Western world, it is still not only going strong but going stronger in other parts of the world, and we forget that at our peril.
So that would be Middle East, Africa,
Middle East,
areas,
Latin America, and yes, Africa, where RT has clearly seen an opening, and it is expanding its operation even as we speak in Africa. It's just very recently established a new, it calls Africa Hub in Johannesburg, and so. As I say, it will perhaps be a little bit misleading to sort of consign RT entirely to the past.
And it's available on social media platforms as well, isn't it? So if you follow certain people who are of a Russian-leaning disposition, let's say, fellow travelers, and of course the trolls themselves, they will retweet and they'll repost a lot of content from RT.
They will, and yes, Twitter has restricted access to RT in your sort of Western domains. You can access RT again using a VPN and set parameters to say, for example, India. So as I say, if you're really keen on following RT on social media, and indeed it is still producing videos, although it's been restricted on YouTube, it's kind of it's now kind of up. So it's now kind of moved a lot of its video content to the Gab platform. So it's and this is perhaps one of the general points I'd want to make about RT. It is quite an adept and agile operator, and not easily kind of squeezed out of existence. And indeed, in many ways, in recent weeks, it has got a new kind of a new head of steam in other parts of the world.
And how did it come about? Was it around, is it more in relation to Bolotnaya and the events of 2012, where there were protests in Moscow, or is it more related to the invasion of Crimea and after that?
No,
when was inception?
Predates that. It's gone through various phases, and it's sort of chameleon-like. It's kind of changed its identity somewhat as the years have gone by. But it's at the same time, I would say it sort of operates in at least three, arguably four different modes. The first of which goes back to its inception in 2005. When it was established as part of the Kremlin's sort of belated recognition of the value of soft power. And so they recognized that they had fallen behind their adversaries in the soft power domain. They have a very different understanding of what soft power is, as you can imagine. And so RT was established under the auspices of the Kremlin in 2005, then as a sort of fairly traditional and really uninventive sort of tool of Russian soft power. And it was quite overt about the fact that its role was to counter negative stories about Russia and to present a positive view of Russia to a global audience. Then in 2008, we had the Georgian War, which Russia saw itself as having lost in the information sphere, and rightly so. And that, of course, was the same year as the financial crisis. It was also the point at which social media really began to take off and to really change the face of the global media landscape. And so at that point, RT kind of reinvented itself. In fact, it changed its name then from Russia Today to the more RT, and began kind of playing down and abandoning a lot of its sort of deliberate pro-Russian soft power content in favor of an identity, or sort of dual identity, in which it was both a reputable international news provider, itself as a rival of BBC and CNN. Of course, Margarita Simonyan, who is still the editor-in-chief, has a very, very different view of what BBC and CNN are. I mean, she like the Russian elite, political elite generally, have this kind of Marxist view of what the media is, and the way they see it is every media player is sort of serving the interests of its sponsor, The BBC is serving the British state, the CNN is serving the American state, and RT is sort of fitting into the paradigm and following the interests or pursuing the interests of the Russian state. And so it, on the one hand, it was genuinely attempting to kind of establish itself within that kind of paradigm of international broadcasters. At the same time, it was probably the very first state broadcaster to adopt this sort of persona of the kind of alt media disruptor, with no regard for sort of conventional rules and modes of operation, setting out to provoke and disrupt and align itself with some of the most marginal actors in Western societies, with a view to performing that kind of disruptive role that you mentioned in your introductory blurb, creating division and so on. And so it's whilst the development has been kind of chronological from one mode to another, in a way it's kept all three modes kind of going, and it kind of oscillates between them, or has been able to oscillate between them, depending on the circumstance and depending on the needs of the context. And then, of course, 2014 and the annexation of Crimea happened, and in a way, RT then adopted a fourth mode, which was that of a much more aggressive tool of information war. Not shy when needed to indulge in outright disinformation, though it's necessary to say that to describe RT as nothing but a tool of disinformation is inaccurate and unhelpful.
And it wouldn't be effective, surely. I mean, if it was 100% lies, it wouldn't cut through anywhere.
Exactly. I mean, up until the restrictions that were imposed earlier this year, as a broadcaster, RT was having to operate in foreign jurisdictions with very, very different journalistic standards and rules. And by and large, it did its best to stay within, albeit at the very margins of those rules and regulations. And that to do nothing other than spout disinformation would not have served its purposes.
And this is why it's so difficult arguing with people who are perhaps less cynical than we are about RT and its intentions. So Russia sees all Western media or all state media like the BBC as extensions of an aggressive foreign policy. Surely they also therefore see RT as a tool for their aggressive foreign policy.
I mean, Margarita Simonyan is on record as having said that she sees RT as a tool of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So she has no shame and no hesitation about the way that she sees RT, but in her own distorted worldview, what she is doing with RT is no different from what the British Foreign Office is doing with the BBC and so on.
Absolutely. And yet, when you see her on the, I think I heard it called agitainment, which is where you have these talking heads screaming at each other, saying fairly outrageous things. Occasionally they'll get a reasonable voice on there and then they'll tear him to pieces. But if you listen to what Margarita Simonyan says, she's clearly smart, but there's a lot of really, toxic, genocidal stuff in there. So anyone who's saying that RT is a legitimate broadcaster, RT was her brainchild, wasn't it? Or she was very influential in its creation and direction.
Yeah, she was certainly. She's been there from the inception, and she, from the outset, she was Putin's golden girl, and was invited to become editor-in-chief at the moment of its launch. She was actually the brainchild of Alexei Gromov, interestingly, since perhaps even prior to the war, she has kind of reinvented herself as
Mm.
chief Kremlin propagandist
Mm.
among the
So you got
uh,
the big four, aren't they? There's who are there? There's Solovyov, Semenyan, and there's two others. There's the guy with the strange jackets.
Kisilyov as yeah. So yeah, and the things she says nowadays are sort of utterly outrageous and unforgivable.
Mm.
Now, of course, like any big organization, the further you get away from the kind of the top of the hierarchy, the more things change. She's adopted this very, very hard line for some years now. But that line did not necessarily, it certainly didn't kind of filter down to other levels. And as we all know, there have been various sort of tensions and disagreements within RT, particularly with respect to some of the foreign presenters it had hired as a necessary part of its legitimation.
Well, many resigned, didn't they? When it made the last phase transition to a harder propaganda tool, they lost a whole swathe of employees.
They did. They've. I mean, this phenomenon can be traced back to. Well, I mean, you'll remember the spate of resignations and on-air protests after the annexation of Crimea. So we had Liz Val, American president, who resigned on air. And then the more interesting one was Abby Martin, who was the kind of, she presented the flagship American show, breaking the mold, I think it was called. And she didn't resign, but she used the last part of the program to present her own protests against the annexation of Crimea. She herself was sort of plucked out of the ruins of the Occupy movement, and you see there's a transactional relationship between RT on the one hand and these sort of big figures, these star presenters that it plucks from the Western media landscape, and they see RT as giving them a platform to promote their agenda. And she has this very typical kind of leftist, anti-globalist, anti-American, anti-hegemonic, anti-imperialist mindset. And to be fair to her, she was true to her principles in denouncing acts of imperialism wherever she saw them, including on Russia's part. So because of that kind of transactional relationship, the idea that Margarita Simonyan can impose her own abhorrent views and extremism and filter them down throughout the output was never a realistic prospect.
And that's why it's so attractive. And in particular, the people I tend to argue with are those on the left. They tend to be people who think quite actively about what's going on in the world, and they try to think critically. And for them, they see these voices, not so much George Galloway, because I don't want to get sued, but he doesn't seem to be a serious character. But you have people like Alex Salmond, you have people who champion genuine points of view for which a strong case can be made, and yet they've been squeezed out of mainstream media. So there's a certain attraction there that you see these people being given a platform.
Yeah, and of course, again, going back to this theme of RT as the kind of adept, agile actor who's able to adapt to circumstances in the US. It has tended to align more with the kind of Tea Party right. And it's sort of, it embraced the, the Trump cause.
Culture wars, those kind of topics. Yes.
Yeah. And although it is no longer broadcasting in the US, it is still an active presence on the margins, or even not so much at the margins, within this kind of American right-wing media ecosystem, which is quite scarily large, and includes Fox TV
and AON, which actually overtook Fox News, which is huge and makes Fox News look like the Guardian in some respects. It's extreme.
And interestingly, quite a few of the narratives, even the war-related narratives that RT and other Russian media have been plugging, have found their way into this alt-right US media ecosystem. And RT is able to adapt and adjust its lexicon accordingly. So, as you will know, this idea, this conspiratorial idea of a deep state, is very, very big on the American right. Well, I mean, it's been embraced even by Trump, hasn't it?
Massively so, yes. And
funnily enough, I think even Boris Johnson has been known to speak about a deep state.
Well, they call it. I think it's Cummings, isn't it? I think they call bureaucracy the blob.
Yeah.
The huge edifice of bureaucracy which they're trying to politicize in the UK.
RT and other Russian actors. Of course, one thing we haven't touched on so far is these sort of these proxy Russian actors who disguise their identity, and to all intents and purposes, they have nothing to do with Russia, but they are in fact sponsored by and run from Moscow or elsewhere in Russia. And the idea of Russophobia, which of course is the key Russian state narrative now, is you can see how it kind of aligns with this sort of conspiratorial deep state notion, and the bioweapons conspiracy, this idea that America is sort of using Ukraine as an experimental ground to try out biological weapons, all kind of conspiratorial fantasy. But you can see how someone attracted to the idea of a deep state, the two things do kind of dovetail with one another. And
Russophobia, yeah, it's one of those labels that stuck, hasn't it? Because there's a great deal of anger around, and there are a tiny minority, but there are occasionally Russians who will do silly things. But if you go and film any beach in Spain in the summer, you'll probably find 1,000 Brits doing silly, reprehensible things. But of course, at this particular time, they get a specific focus, harassing Ukrainians or whatever. And this can feed into that whole debate and be labeled as a sort of Russophobia, the reaction against that. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is the label Russophobia is also applied to oppositionists. Those Russians who've left Russia and are now surviving in the West, they're also thought of as Russophobes by the regime.
So too are those few, not so few, brave oppositions who remained within Russia.
Yes.
They are seen as part of, Putin has overtly referred to them as a fifth column.
Yeah. And this plays very well with Russians, doesn't it? I mean, if you've got any Russian relatives, you lived and traveled in Russia, anyone who lives and leaves the West is almost immediately considered in some way tainted or different, or they don't understand our problems anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, this Russophobia narrative, which, by the way, is not an invention of Putin or the Kremlin, or even the Soviet elites. Its lineage goes back to the sort of 19th century imperial rivalry. So it has a lot of these narratives that we sometimes wrongly kind of attribute to the sort of insanity of Putin, have a much longer lineage. That doesn't excuse Putin in any way, shape, or form, but it does help explain why some of those narratives have more traction than you would otherwise expect them to have.
Absolutely. And different messages in different countries. I think what you said a minute ago gets to the heart of the problem. If I talk to leftist friends of mine, and they'll say, "Oh, but my favorite speaker, my favorite politician, or I heard something original on RT." What they don't realize, or what they seem to project, is that somehow they think RT is championing that point of view, sometimes as if it has some kind of moral skin in the game, not realizing that in another country they will champion a completely different point of view, absolutely at variance with that one. So you have to dig behind the intent, and the intent is clearly to exacerbate divisions. I don't think they can create these issues, but it's to find issues and just tip petrol on the flames to weaken your enemy.
Yes, and you see the fact that they are forced to work with foreign journalists is both an Achilles heel, but also the greatest strength as well. Because if you take, I'm not sure about Alex Salmon, but somebody like Abby Martin, there's no doubting her sincerity. One can certainly question her views, and one can question the wisdom of using RT as a platform. But if you switch on one of her shows and watch her, there's no doubting that she's sincere in what she's doing, and that not everything that she says and shows and does is completely without foundation. But yes, as far as Simonyan and Putin are concerned, she is, serving a useful purpose. But then, as I say, as far as she's concerned, RT is serving her purpose. And
in some ways, the Russian state, the Russian government, have a longer memory, perhaps, than we do. I mean, I think they often reference back to the 19th century, the Great Game. Obviously, for imperial control.
Television program on Channel 1 called The Great Game.
Okay, I didn't know that, but yes, that makes sense.
One of these shows that has kept running throughout the war and is aired much more frequently than it used to. And it has been one of the main sort of tools of war propaganda during these last few months. It was, though no longer, it tends to the host of that program, it's changed over the years, but it tends to be somebody who, with deep knowledge of the US, often someone who has lived in the US. So it was at one point Dimitri Simes, who's actually quite an interesting fellow, with a checkered history, and who does know America very, very well, and has kind of served a sort of double agent role, mediating between the two contexts. Nowadays, it's the host that I've tended to come across is Suslov, who again is an interesting character. He actually has two jobs. He's also an academic, a dean at a prominent Russian university, and he speaks very, very good English. He's lived in the West, and he knows the politicians, he knows the politics, and he knows the language well. And so that show, which is called The Big Game, is precisely about this sort of imperial rivalry and the idea that Russia is a great power doing what great powers do, just as America now, Britain then, were powers and doing what great powers
Doing the same thing, yes.
I mean, there was interesting. I don't know whether you watched it. There was a Channel 4 News did an interview with Suslov. This was, I think it was after the Bucha war crime.
I think I did see that,
Yeah.
and
He was sort of robustly challenged by Matt Fry, who I think
yeah.
was an interviewer, and Suslov's sort of response was one along the lines of, well, look at what the Americans did in Iraq. To which Matt Fry rightly said, how can you use what America did in Iraq as an excuse?
Mm-hmm. It's propaganda 101, aboutism. It's the classic Soviet technique. Yes.
Or rather, does what America did in Iraq excuse
yes
you're doing in Ukraine? And Suslov, of course it does. We're a great power. This is what great powers do.
Mm-hmm.
What can you say to that?
I mean, the thing that will get him angry is to accuse him of being a Potemkin great power and not to question the moral probity, but to simply say, well, you're not a great power. And that's
which is why the recent setbacks that Russia is suffering on the battlefield are a turning point. I mean, not just a turning point on the battlefield, I think, but a potential turning point in the propaganda and in perceptions, domestic perceptions of Putin and of his regime. But that's that's another
question, isn't it? But I mean, the Western press this week have got really excited by they some of them have tuned in perhaps for the first time to these discussion formats in Russia, and they're making a big deal about there being a dissenting voice allowed within the cacophony of extreme language, as if that's new, as if that's some sign of a fracture within the regime. But actually, that entertainment format has always had dissenting voices, has always tried to create a sort of puppet polyphony. So there's nothing new there, is there?
No, there isn't. Although for a period, for certainly the first 3-4 months of the war, Russian television did kind of abandon even that kind of very, very limited pluralism.
Mm-hmm.
And you just got wall-to-wall, univocal Kremlin propaganda and not an inch of deviation in any direction. Day after day, hour after hour. More recently, and one can speculate as to the reasons. One, partly because I don't think that is sustainable.
And people switching off. I was speaking to someone who's been analysing the viewing figures, and actually a lot of those narratives, like denazification, demilitarization, were just not sticking. People were either not believing them or couldn't care less. They were bored.
And exactly. There's only so much of this sort of univocal nonsense that any audience can suffer, and so there has been a tailing off of that approach in recent weeks. A little bit more in the way of limited pluralism, a little bit more in the way of entertainment. So it's not quite the wall-to-wall 9 to 5 or 9 to 9 sort of propaganda. There is now much more entertainment, and so that return to this sort of very controlled, limited pluralism is yes, as you say, in some ways a return to what is for the Russian media landscape on normality. But I think actually I mean the kind of dissenting voices you have heard they've not all dissented from the same point of view. There's been one or two, particularly from the military, who have openly cast doubt on the wisdom of this whole so-called special operation, but they are outnumbered by those who are asking Putin to go further. And this is a signal that we've been too soft.
And generals who speak out tend to have mysterious car accidents and fall down the stairs and arguments with lawnmowers and that kind of stuff.
Those who are critiquing the Kremlin and this military operation from the right, they are empowered. Well, we'd mentioned Simonyan. I was watching, I think it was the Solovyov show, and they were discussing the targeting of electricity supplies in Ukraine, sort of revenge for the setbacks. And Simonyan's sort of response was, "You mean there's actually infrastructure left in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Why do we not take it out in the first weeks?" Yeah,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it's a war crime. It has to be noted that activity is a pure banned by the Geneva Convention, but she doesn't seem to be aware of that.
Solovyov, a little earlier, was openly advocating Russian soldiers kill as many Ukrainians as possible. Mm-hmm. And those were almost literally his words. This, of course, you won't find this in any official Kremlin rhetoric, but these voices, I think, reflect a genuine frustration on the part of a very vocal and quite powerful kind of right, who are genuinely frustrated with the way this war is going. But at the same time, you have had occasional kind of protests from the other side, really sort of questioning whether the war was the right thing to do anyway.
And that comes back a little bit to, and it's the worrying part of it, comes back a little bit to Navalny's technique, doesn't it? He realized that if you go head to head on a moral argument, on a traditional Western political argument, you're going to lose and lose badly. If you advocate for disbanding the Russian Empire, which is probably what needs to happen in order to start evolving the country, you will never ever get elected. Hence Navalny's toying with some nationalist values to start with, and then they moved, of course, to corruption. So most Russians will not say, we need to be much better morally, or we need to do this, or we need to fit into the global ecosystem, but they will respond to, poor roads, infrastructure not working, things that affect their individual daily lives, and the rich officials who are seen to be lining their pockets. And that does resonate. Equally, in the war, resistance or a coup is in some ways more likely to come from those who are frustrated with the pace of the war rather than wanting to stop it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm not a specialist in public opinion, and it's notoriously difficult to measure at the best of times, let alone now. But in as much as I am kind of abreast of shifts in opinion, it would seem that a large majority of the population are not pro-war. They really just don't want to think about it, talk about it. As long as it's not affecting them, then they'll broadly, implicitly kind of endorse it, but with minimal enthusiasm. And then there is this really worryingly large vocal minority of hotheads who really want to go much further. And then the kind of opposition movement has been understandably cowed into silence, and sadly, of course, a lot of them have felt they had no choice but to leave Russia.
Yeah, most have left or are in prison, haven't they? And I was speaking to someone who is a sort of expert in sociology and the media, and they were saying, you and I, we would listen to Navalny, we would listen to some of the mainstream liberal channels like Erka Moskvy and Dorscht, which are now available online, and they resonate very strongly with us. And she made the point that actually the language that they use, the topics they focus on, broadly speaking, are not actually of interest.
Yeah.
And the broad, sweep of the Russian population would not look at those people in the opposition as being of the same class or having the same interests as them, which is quite worrying.
Yeah. Of course, as your the sort of notional title you gave this sort of conversation hints, there is a generational divide.
Yes.
So the older generation, people 50 plus, still rely quite heavily on television for their sources of information.
60 to 70%, 60% hardcore get most of their media from television, and you can expand that to probably 70 or 80 that will dip in and have it as part of their media diet.
Whereas, under 40, certainly, there's much more kind of media savviness, and they will know how to access alternative sources of information. The opinion divide is mirrors that generational gap to a large extent. But what I've also found in just anecdotally speaking to those few Russians that I am able still to speak to is that don't necessarily expect to get a consistent view. You'll find people who are very much opposed to Putin, don't like him, would much rather have a more Western style kind of democratic system, but who nonetheless supported the annexation of Crimea and think that Russia has been harshly treated and understand why NATO expanded its membership and so on. So a lot of the views are hybrid. There's a sort of group of oppositionists, a group of Kremlin supporters, and a group of far-right hopheads, all sort of operating within consistent sort of. It's not right.
And actually, propaganda creates narratives for every purpose. It creates narratives for all these people. So I get the same experience. I mean, I've been talking to intelligentsia, people who actually have been arrested and slung in the back of one of the vans and taken off to the CISO, which is the holding pens, as it were, locked up either overnight or more recently for more like 15 days. Even amongst these people, they will be opposed to the war and opposed to Putin, but you will then get some kind of dissonance where, but NATO did this, NATO did that, or the higher level intellectual one, the one that really designed to appeal to people who think, but this is an inevitable historical process. Yeah. This isn't just the whims of an autocrat. Yeah. This was going to happen anyway, and it's all the global arms industry. They've orchestrated the whole thing.
Yeah, and this is why, again, to return to something I touched on earlier, it is important to understand the lineages of some of these propaganda narratives, to explain their resonance on the one hand, but also how adaptable they are. So this sort of, and of course to a much lesser extent, you can observe the same phenomenon in Britain, where this sort of imperial nostalgia, it's still a factor, isn't it? In albeit in a much more moderated fashion.
Yes.
But
that's not to be too political, but looking at the methodology that was used by Leave and Remain, one tried to deal with arguments and facts and the messy complexity of life, and they did that fairly badly, which was the Remain campaign. The Leave campaign, however, by jettisoning the need for those facts, were able to paint a much simpler, much more attractive, I wouldn't call it sort of Disneyland or but they were able, if you jettison the idea of objective fact, you are able to create some fairly attractive fantasy realities.
Yeah, and if you can ground them in sort of narratives that have this sort of cultural lineage and heritage to them, then they're all the more resonant. And interestingly, you see what is perhaps distinctive to Russia and unlike Britain is that on the one hand they have this sort of still lingering imperial nostalgia, which, by the way, can translate into much more kind of moderate, acceptable narratives of the thought. Russia is a great power. In certain circumstances, that's not such a sort of reprehensible idea to contemplate. But then it can mutate into the kind of fantasies and immoral sort of actions that we're seeing in Ukraine. But there's also Russia's historical sense of itself as a victim of imperialism, as some kind of almost colony of the West, not in a literal sense, but culturally, economically, and politically. Going back to the 19th century, Russia has, on the one hand, as I said, seen itself as an imperial actor on a par with Britain, France, and so on, but at the same time, seen itself as a victim of colonialism, and that still resonates. And now once again, there's a sort of reasonable version of that narrative, which simply says that, as a member of civilized humanity, we should recognize the sovereignty of nations. So this emphasis you got under Medvedev of sovereignty. So it's a sovereign nation, and its interests and its view should be respected. But then in the more distortive version, Russia is being recolonized, and Ukraine is being used as a platform from which to establish the recolonization of Russia. And there are these kind of fifth columnists also operating with this view to recolonize Russia.
Which is already in the realm of almost complete fantasy. And weaponized. I mean, you can weaponize those grievances, which is what they've done very effectively.
But because they have this long lineage, and they've recurred in multiple forms over certainly the last couple of centuries, they have this sort of certain legitimacy and credibility to them that often we find it hard to sort of stomach and hard to understand. And I think it's really important that you pay attention to the origins, provenances, and different versions of these narratives, rather than, as sometimes tends to be the case, just simply to describe it all as toxic disinformation produced by this sort of vertical of power, with Putin sitting at the top and churning it out in this utterly kind of instrumental fashion.
He's inherited a lot that has enabled him to create that power base.
I mean, let's not forget that this horrendous idea that Ukraine is not really a nation and belongs as part of Russia, this was the view of many in the Russian political and cultural elite, including, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Quite an extreme form of it, in fact. He is a... I
mean, he was a kind of, rightly, as a dissident hero of opposition to Soviet oppression. And so,
Could one even say Gorbachev? I mean, this is going to sound quite horrific to some people, but Gorbachev in some ways was a soft imperialist in the way that Putin is a hard imperialist. Absolutely. They wanted to preserve greater Russia.
Absolutely, yes. So the sort of good guy, bad guy kind of approach is rarely credible in any context, but it's certainly not in the case of Russia. Gorbachev himself is a product of of the Soviet system and of the narratives that prevail there, and so unsurprisingly, you get some of those same narratives coming through in a much softer and more moderate form in his pronouncements. So, I think these sort of things are really important, because if you're going to combat a threat, and we're in no doubt that in its current mode of existence is a nasty threat, then one really has to understand it.
And that was going to be my last question, actually, and it's probably an impossible one to answer. Well, I had two questions, actually. One was, can we know how the editorial processes work within the RT, which is more of a sort of fact-based question. But the other one, of course, is that, in marketing, as in propaganda, you can't fight propaganda with propaganda. In the same way, these narratives we've been talking about, these myths from history, you can't just tell people they're lies or they have no validity. Yeah. You have to present an alternative view, and then you have to repeat it over maybe years or decades. Yeah. So how on earth do we counter the situation that we're in?
Yeah. Well, I don't have a sort of recipe for dealing with Putin. I agree with what you said. I would add. Well, I'll come back to your first question about editorial process, but the bigger question you raised, I would add to what you've said, that it's really important that we reflect on our own words and actions and try to predict how they might play out within this fantasy land, if you like, of Russian propaganda, and which is why, I mean, I'm ambivalent, but I have certain. There were times when I got slightly worried about the rush to ban everything Russian.
Yes.
By all means, target Putin and his henchmen, oligarchs, and so on. But as soon as you start kind of, as soon as you start targeting Russia more broadly, you do have to sort of try to think to yourself, how is this going to be interpreted and replayed?
It's a gift. It's a gift for propagandists, in fact, yes.
Yeah. And I also, I mean, again, on the same lines, and it takes us back to RT. Interestingly, well, you probably know this, RT's branding motto up until recently was question more. So the idea that the kind of audiences it is appealing to are those who are being asked to question not what Russia is doing, but what is happening in societies. And RT is providing them with the news, the information that you won't get from the mainstream media in order to question more. It's now abandoned that branding motto. Its new branding motto is freedom over censorship, truth over narratives.
Yes, the irony.
The irony, but it is, as I say, to return to the first theme I developed, it's adeptness, this ability to internalize the other's view of itself and to reproject it in what, yes, RT is going to be laughed out of court here with that branding motto. I wouldn't be so certain that the same is true in India.
No.
It has an expanding market, let alone the Middle East or Latin America or Africa.
And even America, even amongst the alt-right in America, that would have a lot of resonance.
Yeah. So,
and Mr. Hutchings as well, of course. I mean, we'll mention him though.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, was it right for Ofcom to rescind RT's license? Probably. I mean, I watched RT during the first few weeks of the war, and undoubtedly it breached impartiality time after time. Interestingly, it kind of rode back from that just as the threat appeared across their eyes. And in fact, as a sort of personal anecdote, I think it was a couple of days before Ofcom rescinded its license, I got an email from RT. Would you like to come and appear on the Afshan Ratanzi Going Underground show? We'd like to emphasize that not only are you able to criticize Putin, we would actually welcome criticism of Putin. I'm pleased to say I got my refusal in before the show was pulled anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
But these sort of blanket bans, restrictions, from a moral point of view, one can absolutely support them and justify them. But
culture, especially, banning not banning literature, but banning events around literature or music. Fair enough. Individuals who might have expressed political support for Putin or Crimea, that's fine, but not the broad culture itself, because surely the only way out of the divisiveness that not only Russia is in, but also the divisive situation we have in Britain and America, surely culture is really the only way we're going to find common ground.
I'm a great believer in building bridges through sub-state and non-state structures. And if you start issuing blanket bans, that's not going to work. But of course, also, it's important to remember that certainly in the UK, media and variety was not a great success. I mean, its viewing figures were abysmal. It had a little more success on social media, but actually nothing like the extent to which it claimed.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's been very mendacious about its own kind of audience figures, and why, in a way, by banning it and drawing attention to it, you're actually giving it exactly what it needs to boost those that performance. So I think that's a point I would add to what you said. As to the editorial processes, well, they change according to circumstance. So in a so-called normal period, Moscow takes a relatively hands-off approach to what art is. It delegates responsibility to local actors, because it knows that those local actors will know the culture, know the environment, know what passes and what doesn't. And, the idea of Moscow kind of pulling the strings at every point just would be ineffective.
But it has a template, surely. It has, and they're not going out and saying, oh, be like the BBC or be like the Guardian. They must have an overall template, which is, we're going to explore minority points of view. We're going to explore divisive issues, and there must be a broad editorial.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is as is the case, or has been the case with Russian journalists more generally. A lot of it implicit and comes in the form of self-censorship. You don't have to tell me what to do and what not to do, what to say and what not to say. The fact that I'm working for you tells you that I already know, and give a little bit of leeway, a little bit of string, and I won't tug it too hard. I'll use that leeway in a way that will be most effective to your ultimate goals. So certainly on the big stories, and those stories where Russia had sort of direct stake, there you would get much more kind of intrusion and influence from Moscow offices. But everything else, they were by and large left to their own devices. If you talk to the likes of Alex Salmond, Abby Martin, and there was this, there have been other presenters, sort of high-profile presenters, both in America and the UK. They have, by and large, been given sort of relative editorial freedom. So, the idea that Alex Salmond is kind of following a script handed to him by Simonian,
that's not how it works. Yeah, no.
Not at all. Not even now. Even now, I was talking about these three modes of operation, voice of Russian interests, reputable international broadcaster, out media disruptor. They still pertain.
Yeah.
So in India, for example, RT is still trying to kind of convince its audience that it is a reputable international news provider on a par with CNN and the BBC. And therefore it is sort of maintaining some of the basic standards. Though it's very kind of cunning and actually quite consistent in its attribution of quotes.
It's no different from Fox News in that sense that if they invite a speaker on and then speaker goes further than the string they've been given, it's not they're going to censor them in that session. They might challenge their views. They just won't invite them back again. And RT works in the same fashion. So anyone like Salmond or Galloway who've been on it repeatedly, they clearly understand where those limitations lie. They know the rules.
Exactly. But the really extreme views, the real disinformation that you do get on is relegated to or consigned to the op-eds. So there you can more or less say whatever you like because it's not RT's opinion, it's the opinion of the commentator.
And there's a whole different editorial structure which goes into building those weaponized narratives. And we know there's a machine of people and editors that construct those narratives.
But I've been following the reporting of the of these defeats that Russia has suffered on the battlefield, which have been skirted over in mainstream Russian news. RT has openly reported them, but as Ukrainian claims, quotes. They understand how attribution works and how it enables you to remain within the parameters of impartial reporting. And they're continuing to do that because there is still RT English content. I can show it to you now on my smartphone.
And it's external, isn't it? I mean, it's worth just pointing out that RT is largely intended for an external audience. It's not really consumed internally. That's a different media environment.
Of course, there is an RT Russian channel. Well, it doesn't broadcast, but there is an active RT Russian web output, and that is the Kremlin has begun channeling more resources to that. That was underfunded. They've now been channeling far more resources to it, but not so much for the domestic audiences, but for the Russian-speaking audiences in the former Soviet Union. So yes, I mean the differences in coverage across the different languages is yet another story. It's a complex, agile, adept organization that we should be careful not to mischaracterize and not to oversimplify. And taking that approach, we're much better placed to kind of combat the threat that it represents.
Well, Stephen, I think that's a perfect summary for the conversation. And anyone who is interested about RT and how it functions, I think it's worth going in with their eyes open if they are consuming the content. So this has been a brilliant discussion. I very much appreciate you spending so much time to deconstruct that with us. And well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Yes.